July 14, 1943. The afternoon heat shimmered above the desert highway leading into Verde Valley, Arizona, a farming community of barely 3,000 souls nestled between red rock formations and cotton fields. Charlotte Webb stood at the window of her family's diner, watching a convoy of military trucks roll down Main Street with cargo that would change her life forever. Inside those canvas-covered vehicles sat 247 Italian prisoners of war, the first enemy soldiers most residents had ever seen outside newsreels at the picture show. They were young men with dark hair and sun-weathered faces, wearing remnants of uniforms from an army that had fought against American boys like Charlotte's fiancé Thomas, who was somewhere in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. Charlotte was 22 years old, with auburn hair she kept pinned back for work and green eyes that her mother always said revealed too much of what she was thinking. She had been engaged to Thomas Brennan for 8 months, wearing his grandmother's ring and writing him letters every Sunday without fail. They had planned to marry when he returned, to take over her father's diner and raise a family in the same town where they had both grown up. The war had put those plans on hold, like it had for so many young couples across America. Now she stood watching enemy soldiers arrive in her hometown, feeling a complicated mixture of resentment and something she could not quite name. Her father, Robert Webb, emerged from the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron, flour dusting his forearms. He was a broad-shouldered man of 53 who had fought in the Great War and never talked about it. He stood beside Charlotte at the window, observing the convoy with careful assessment. "Those are just boys," he said quietly. "Somebody's sons, far from home." Charlotte wanted to argue that they were also the enemy, that American boys were dying because of what their country had done. But looking at the tired faces visible through gaps in the truck canvas, she found herself thinking about Thomas, wondering if he looked that exhausted, that defeated, that far from the confident young man who had kissed her goodbye. The convoy turned off Main Street toward the edge of town, where Army engineers had constructed a prisoner of war camp in just 6 weeks. It sat on 40 acres of desert scrubland, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers that looked strange against the backdrop of red rocks and endless sky. The government had promised the camp would bring jobs and money to Verde Valley, that local farms could contract prisoner labor to help with the chronic shortage of workers. Most young men from the area had enlisted or been drafted, leaving crops unharvested and businesses struggling. The Italian prisoners represented a solution to a desperate problem, though no one wanted to admit they needed help from enemy soldiers. Before we discover what happened when Charlotte Webb first spoke to an Italian prisoner of war, understand that this was not a story anyone in Verde Valley expected to tell. The first Italian prisoners arrived at the Webb farm on July 21, 1943, transported in a military truck under supervision of 2 American guards. Charlotte watched from the farmhouse porch as 10 men climbed down from the vehicle, stretching stiff limbs and looking around at the landscape with expressions ranging from resignation to quiet appreciation. They wore faded work clothes marked with the letters P and W in white paint, designating them as prisoners of war. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, and Charlotte found herself thinking that the heat must remind them of home, of Mediterranean summers they might never see again. Among the 10 prisoners was Antonio Russo, though Charlotte would not learn his name for 3 more days. He was 25 years old, tall and lean with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. Before the war, he had been an architecture student in Naples, studying classical proportions of ancient buildings and dreaming of designing structures that would stand for centuries. Instead, he had been conscripted, sent to North Africa, and captured by British forces before being transferred to American custody and shipped across an ocean to a desert that looked nothing like home. He noticed Charlotte immediately, the young woman standing on the porch with her arms crossed, watching them with an expression he could not quite read. The work was hard but not cruel. Robert Webb was a fair man who believed in honest labor and honest pay, even if the pay went to the United States government rather than the prisoners themselves. He showed them the irrigation system that needed repair, the fences that needed mending, the fields where cotton grew in neat rows waiting for harvest. The prisoners nodded, understanding through gestures and broken English what was expected of them. Antonio had learned some English in school, enough to understand basic instructions, though he remained quiet, uncertain of his accent, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Charlotte tried to maintain distance those first days, busying herself with farmhouse chores and diner work, avoiding the fields where the prisoners labored. But the farm was not large enough to truly avoid anyone, and the prisoners needed water brought to them during the hottest parts of the day. On the third day, she carried a bucket of water and a ladle to where the men worked on irrigation ditches, their shirts soaked with sweat, their hands blistered from unfamiliar tools. They looked up when she approached, grateful expressions crossing tired faces. "Grazie," one of them said. She nodded, keeping her eyes down. But when Antonio stepped forward to take the ladle, their fingers brushed accidentally, and Charlotte found herself looking up into dark brown eyes that held an intelligence and sadness she had not expected to see. "Grazie, signorina," he said quietly, his accent making the simple words sound almost musical. "You are welcome," Charlotte replied automatically, then walked quickly back to the farmhouse, her heart beating faster than the brief encounter warranted. She told herself it was nothing, just the startling realization that prisoners of war were not faceless enemies but individual human beings. But that night, lying in bed with Thomas's letter on her nightstand, she found herself remembering Antonio's eyes, the quiet dignity in his thank you, the way he had immediately stepped back after their fingers touched. August brought monsoon season to Arizona, brief violent storms that turned the desert into a temporary garden. Charlotte's conversations with Antonio became more frequent, despite her best intentions to maintain proper distance. They spoke during water breaks, brief exchanges that never lasted more than a few minutes but somehow contained more honesty than hours of conventional conversation. Antonio told her about Naples, about studying ancient Roman ruins, about his family's small apartment overlooking the bay. Charlotte told him about Verde Valley, about growing up in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, about her dreams of traveling someday to places she had only read about in books. Charlotte discovered she was not alone in her forbidden feelings. At the diner one afternoon, Susan Palmer, a schoolteacher whose husband was serving in Europe, lingered after lunch with an expression that Charlotte recognized as someone carrying a secret they desperately needed to share. Susan was 27, practical and level-headed, the last person anyone would expect to break social conventions. She waited until the other customers had left, then spoke quietly. "Charlotte, I need to talk to someone who might understand. There is a prisoner who works at the school, helping to repair the building. His name is Marco. We have been talking." Charlotte nodded slowly, her own secret suddenly feeling less isolating. Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I love my husband. I write to him every week. But when I talk to Marco, I feel alive in ways I had forgotten were possible." Over the following weeks, Charlotte discovered that she and Susan were not alone. Mary Chen, whose son fought with the Japanese-American battalion, had formed a friendship with an Italian prisoner named Giovanni, who worked at her husband's hardware store. Dorothy Morrison, the sheriff's wife, had been bringing extra food to the camp medical officer, an Italian doctor named Benedetti, who reminded her of her own father. Rita Sanchez, whose brothers were fighting in Italy, had started teaching English to prisoners at the Catholic Church. Each woman had her own story, her own guilt and confusion about feeling compassion or attraction to men they were supposed to hate. These women began meeting quietly at Charlotte's diner after hours, an unofficial support group for women navigating impossible emotional terrain. They were not bad women. They were loyal Americans who genuinely loved their husbands and fiancés, who prayed for Allied victory, who contributed to war bond drives. But they were also human beings who had formed connections with other human beings, and those connections refused to conform to neat categories of patriotism and betrayal. "What are we supposed to do?" Mary Chen asked, her voice desperate. "Tell me how to stop caring about Giovanni. Tell me how to forget that he tells me about his mother's olive groves, about dreams of returning to university someday." Charlotte's relationship with Antonio deepened in small increments, each conversation revealing more of who they were beneath their designated roles. Antonio sketched architectural details in the dirt to show her what he meant by corbels and buttresses. Charlotte told him about books she loved, about wanting to study literature at university someday. They never touched beyond accidental brushes during water deliveries, never spoke words of affection openly, but the connection between them grew undeniable, impossible to ignore, dangerous to acknowledge. By October 1943, the whispers had become voices, and the voices had become accusations. Verde Valley was a small town where secrets had short lifespans, and the gatherings of local women with Italian prisoners had not gone unnoticed. The first confrontation came at the diner when Mrs. Patterson, who had been coming to Webb's for 30 years, announced loudly that she would no longer patronize an establishment run by Nazi sympathizers. Charlotte, serving coffee, stopped mid-pour. "We are not Nazi sympathizers," she said carefully. "The Italians are not Nazis. They were fighting against their will." "Against their will?" Mrs. Patterson's voice rose indignantly. "Tell that to my nephew who died in North Africa fighting Italian soldiers." The encounter shook Charlotte more than she wanted to admit. That evening, she attended the informal gathering of women at her own diner. The atmosphere was tense. Susan Palmer had been confronted by the school board about Marco, warned that developing personal relationships with prisoners was inappropriate and could cost her job. Mary Chen reported that customers at the hardware store had complained about Giovanni's presence. Rita Sanchez had been told by Father O'Brien to be mindful of appearances. The message was clear. The town was losing patience with women who seemed to be forgetting the boundaries between captor and captive, between American loyalty and enemy sympathy. Dorothy Morrison brought the most disturbing news. Her husband, the sheriff, had been approached by townsmen demanding stricter regulations on prisoner labor, limiting their hours, restricting their movements, ending all social events. The men claimed concern about security, but Dorothy knew the real motivation was discomfort with connections between Italian prisoners and local women. The sheriff had listened politely, but made no promises. But he had come home and asked Dorothy directly if anything inappropriate was happening at the camp, anything he should know about as both law enforcement officer and husband. Charlotte listened to her friends share their struggles and felt the weight of collective guilt and confusion. They were not bad women. They were loyal Americans who genuinely loved their husbands and fiancés. But they were also human beings who had formed connections that refused to conform to wartime logic. You could not unknow someone once you knew them. You could not unfeel emotions simply because those emotions were inconvenient or socially unacceptable. The women sat in Charlotte's diner long after closing, drinking coffee that grew cold, sharing fears and hopes and terrible awareness that their choices would have consequences they could not yet fully anticipate. The confrontation Charlotte had been dreading came 3 days later when her father asked her to join him in the farm office. Robert Webb sat behind his desk, looking older than Charlotte remembered. "Charlotte, I need you to tell me the truth. Is there something happening between you and one of the Italian prisoners?" Charlotte's first instinct was to deny, to minimize. But looking at her father's face, she found herself unable to lie. "His name is Antonio," she said quietly. "We talk sometimes. Nothing inappropriate has happened, but I have feelings for him." November brought cooler temperatures to Arizona and desperate need for discretion. Charlotte and Antonio could no longer speak openly during farm work. Guards had been instructed to maintain stricter supervision, and other prisoners avoided anything that might draw attention or jeopardize their comfortable work assignments. But human connection, once established, finds ways to survive even in hostile environments. The solution came from Private Daniel Cooper, one of the younger guards assigned to prisoner transport duty. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Missouri, where he had left behind his own sweetheart. He recognized the look in Charlotte's eyes when Antonio was near, recognized it from his own mirror when thinking about Betty back home. One afternoon, he approached Charlotte while she sorted mail at the farm office. "Miss Webb, I probably should not be telling you this, but there is a way for you and that Italian fellow to communicate without anyone knowing. Letters. I can deliver them between you and the prisoner. No one checks personal correspondence that guards carry." Charlotte's heart pounded. "What you are suggesting," she began, but Cooper interrupted gently. "What I am suggesting is that two young people who care about each other deserve a chance to talk. My girl Betty, I write her every day. Seems to me you and Antonio deserve the same chance." That night, Charlotte wrote her first letter to Antonio, pouring onto paper all the thoughts and feelings she had been forced to suppress. She wrote about her confusion, about loving Thomas but feeling drawn to Antonio in ways she could not explain or resist. She wrote about the town's condemnation, about her mother's disappointment, about her father's warning that any feelings between them had no future. She wrote 3 pages before forcing herself to stop, hiding the letter beneath the loose board where Private Cooper had indicated. 2 days later, a response appeared in the same hiding place, Antonio's handwriting, elegant despite being written with pencil stub on rough paper. "Dear C," he began, honoring their agreement to use only initials. "I receive your letter with joy and sorrow both. Joy because your words tell me I am not alone in these feelings that make no sense but feel more true than anything I have known. Sorrow because you are right that we have no future, no possibility beyond these stolen moments. I should tell you to forget me, to love your Thomas who waits for you. I should be honorable and step away. But I am not so honorable as I wish to be. I think of you constantly." The correspondence continued through November and into December. Letters exchanged 2 or 3 times weekly, each revealing more depth, more vulnerability, more impossible longing. Antonio sent her sketches, not just of her but of architectural details he imagined designing someday. Charlotte sent him poems she had written, terrible amateur verses that embarrassed her but which Antonio praised as beautiful because they were honest. They discussed everything: books they had read, music they loved, places they dreamed of visiting. They wrote about philosophy and religion and whether war ever achieved anything worth the cost. January 1944 arrived with news that altered Charlotte and Antonio's impossible situation. Italy, having surrendered to Allied forces in September 1943, was now technically a co-belligerent nation rather than an enemy state. The change in status created administrative confusion about Italian prisoners in American camps. Were they still prisoners or Allied personnel? The War Department issued contradictory directives while politicians debated and military commanders improvised solutions. For the Italian prisoners in Arizona, the practical change was gradual but significant. Guards became less vigilant. Restrictions on movement loosened. Work assignments expanded beyond basic labor to include skilled positions that utilized prisoners' actual training. Antonio, with his architectural background, was assigned to help with construction projects around Verde Valley, designing and building structures rather than simply repairing fences. The shift brought him into town more frequently, no longer merely a prisoner on a farm, but a semi-free foreign worker whose presence, while still controversial, could no longer be called enemy collaboration. Charlotte had been avoiding Antonio since Christmas, frightened by the intensity of her feelings as expressed in their letters, trying to create distance before Thomas's expected leave. But Antonio's new assignments made avoidance impossible. She encountered him at the hardware store, at the post office, at the church where Father O'Brien had asked him to help repair the bell tower. The crisis came in late January when a telegram arrived at the Webb house. Charlotte had been dreading this moment, knowing Thomas's leave was approaching, knowing she would have to face him while carrying secrets that would destroy him if revealed. But the telegram brought different news. "We regret to inform you that Private Thomas Brennan has been wounded in action in the Pacific Theater. He is receiving medical treatment and is expected to survive. Further information will follow." Charlotte read the words 3 times, her hands shaking. Relief that Thomas was alive mixed with guilt, that her first emotion was not pure joy but complicated awareness that his injury delayed the confrontation she feared. Her mother found her sitting at the kitchen table, the telegram clutched in her trembling hands. Eleanor read it over Charlotte's shoulder, then pulled her daughter into an embrace. "He will be all right," she said firmly. "Thomas is strong. He will come home to you." But Charlotte was not sure she wanted him to come home, not yet. Not when she was still writing letters to Antonio that grew more passionate with each exchange. Not when she could not imagine her life without the connection she had built with a man who was supposed to be temporary, insignificant, forgettable. That night, Charlotte wrote to Antonio about the telegram, about her complicated feelings, about guilt and relief tangled together in ways that made no sense. Antonio's response came quickly, his words careful and thoughtful. "See, I am glad your Thomas lives. I am sad for his injury but grateful he survives. I know what you must be feeling, the guilt of caring for me while he suffers. Perhaps his injury is a sign that you should end our correspondence, that you should prepare your heart for his return. I will understand if you choose this path. I will be sad, but I will understand." By spring 1944, the network of women who loved Italian prisoners had grown bolder despite increasing community opposition. The change in Italian status, from enemy to co-belligerent, provided technical justification for relationships that had been purely forbidden before. Some couples began appearing together in public, testing boundaries, challenging assumptions about what was acceptable. Susan Palmer and Marco were seen walking together near the school. Mary Chen brought Giovanni to her family's hardware store openly rather than sneaking meetings. Rita Sanchez invited prisoners to attend English classes at the church without hiding the personal connections that had developed. The boldness came with consequences but also with determination born of love strong enough to risk everything. Charlotte and Antonio were more cautious, aware that Charlotte's engagement to Thomas made their situation different from women whose husbands might never return. But Antonio's work in town created legitimate reasons for them to interact, and they took advantage of every opportunity. They spoke at the hardware store while Antonio purchased supplies. They encountered each other at the post office. They sat in the same pew at church, separated by 3 other people but aware of each other's presence with intensity that made conventional worship nearly impossible. The town noticed, of course. Verde Valley noticed everything. But without explicit misconduct to point to, critics were limited to disapproving looks and whispered condemnations. The most dramatic development came when Dorothy Morrison announced she was filing for divorce from her husband, the sheriff, to marry Dr. Benedetti. The news exploded through Verde Valley like a bomb. Dorothy Morrison, respected sheriff's wife, pillar of the community, was abandoning her marriage of 20 years for an Italian prisoner. The scandal consumed every conversation, every gathering, every thought in a town that prided itself on traditional values and wartime loyalty. The sheriff, humiliated and angry, threatened to have Dr. Benedetti transferred to a camp across the country. But Dorothy stood firm, declaring that she had spent 20 years in a loveless marriage and refused to waste whatever time she had left pretending to be happy. Her courage inspired others. Within 2 weeks, 3 more couples announced their intentions to marry once legal obstacles could be overcome. The Italian prisoners were no longer technically enemies, but they were foreign nationals with uncertain immigration status. Marrying an American citizen did not automatically grant them the right to remain in the United States. The women began working with lawyers, writing to congressmen, challenging bureaucratic rules that seemed designed to prevent exactly what they were attempting. They formed an unofficial advocacy group, pooling resources and information, supporting each other through the complex legal and social battles ahead. Charlotte watched these developments with mixture of admiration and fear. These women were burning bridges, choosing love over security, risking everything for uncertain futures. Could she do the same? Should she? Thomas's letters had resumed after his injury, written from a military hospital in Hawaii where he was recovering. He wrote about missing her, about wanting to come home, about finalizing their wedding plans. Each letter was a knife in Charlotte's conscience. How could she betray a wounded soldier who had sacrificed so much? How could she not follow her heart when these other women were showing such courage? August 1945 brought victory over Japan Day and the end of World War II. Across America, celebrations erupted with joy and relief that the long nightmare was finally over. But for Charlotte Webb and Antonio Russo, the end of war meant the beginning of impossible choices. Repatriation orders were issued for all remaining Italian nationals in American prisoner of war camps. Despite Italy's co-belligerent status, despite the friendships and relationships formed, the Italian men were expected to return to their devastated homeland. Transportation would begin in September, with all Italian prisoners scheduled to depart American soil by year's end. The deadline created urgency that could no longer be denied or delayed. Charlotte and Antonio met secretly at the construction site where he had been working, late in the evening after other workers had left. It was the first time they had truly been alone together, without guards or supervision or the constant awareness of watching eyes. Antonio looked at Charlotte with expression of love and anguish mixed together. "I have to return to Italy," he said quietly. "I have to find my family, to see what remains of my home. You understand this, yes?" Charlotte nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. But what happens to us?" Antonio took her hands, the first time they had touched with intention rather than accident. "What happens to us depends on what you want, Charlotte. I love you. I have loved you since that first day when you brought water to the fields. I want to marry you, to build a life with you. But I cannot ask you to leave everything, to follow me to a country you have never seen, to a future that promises nothing but uncertainty." Charlotte looked into the dark eyes she had come to know so well through letters and stolen conversations. Everything she had been taught, everything her community expected, everything that made practical sense said she should let Antonio go, should marry Thomas when he returned, should choose the safe, familiar path. But standing there in the fading light, Charlotte realized that safety was not the same as happiness, that familiar was not the same as right, that practical sense sometimes meant betraying your own heart. "I will go with you," she heard herself say. "I will go to Italy. I will marry you. Whatever we face together." Antonio pulled her into an embrace, the first time they had held each other, and Charlotte felt certainty she had been searching for throughout months of confusion and guilt. But certainty did not make the path easier. Charlotte's announcement to her family that she was breaking her engagement with Thomas and planning to marry Antonio created devastation she had anticipated but still found overwhelming. Her mother wept. Her father retreated into angry silence. Her siblings looked at her with mixture of confusion and betrayal. "You are throwing away everything for a man you barely know," Eleanor said through her tears. "You are abandoning a good man who loves you, who fought for this country, who deserves better than this betrayal." Charlotte tried to explain that love was not something you chose logically, that Antonio was not barely known but deeply understood through their correspondence, but her words sounded hollow against her mother's grief. Breaking the engagement with Thomas was even more painful. Charlotte wrote a letter explaining everything, confessing her relationship with Antonio, apologizing for the betrayal, releasing Thomas from all promises between them. She mailed it knowing Thomas would receive it in the military hospital, knowing her words would wound him when he was already injured. The guilt was crushing, but Charlotte forced herself to face it honestly. She had betrayed Thomas. She had chosen another man. She deserved his anger and his pain. All she could offer was truthfulness about why. The practical obstacles were enormous. Marrying Antonio as an Italian national required special permission. Charlotte needed a passport and visa for Italy. They needed money for passage, for establishing a new life. Charlotte sold her engagement ring, the symbol of the future she was abandoning, using the money to begin preparations for the future she was choosing. Antonio wrote to his family in Naples, explaining that he was bringing an American wife home. The response was cautious, but welcoming. His mother wrote that any woman Antonio loved would be welcomed as a daughter. September 1945 found Charlotte and Antonio preparing for departure. The wedding took place in a small civil ceremony, with only Private Cooper as witness, the young guard who had enabled their correspondence now standing with them as they exchanged vows. Charlotte wore a simple blue dress rather than a wedding gown. Antonio wore the best clothes he owned, civilian clothing provided by the repatriation program. There were no flowers, no family, no celebration. Just two people promising to build a life together against impossible odds. Charlotte felt joy and terror in equal measure. She was now Charlotte Russo, married to a man she loved desperately but barely knew in conventional terms, preparing to leave the only home she had ever known for a country she had only read about in books. Her parents refused to attend the wedding or say goodbye. Eleanor told Charlotte that she was dead to them, that they could not bless a union built on betrayal and abandonment. Charlotte's younger sister Anna was the only family member brave enough to visit before departure. She brought a small suitcase of clothing and a photograph album, practical gifts that acknowledged reality even if the rest of the family could not. "I do not understand what you are doing," Anna said honestly. "But I love you, and I hope you find happiness." Charlotte hugged her sister, knowing it might be years or even decades before they saw each other again. The journey to Italy took 3 weeks, traveling by train to New York, then by ship across the Atlantic to Naples. Charlotte watched America disappear behind her, feeling the weight of her choice settle into permanent reality. There was no going back now. She had married Antonio. She had abandoned her family, her town, her country for love. The voyage was difficult. Charlotte suffered terrible seasickness. Antonio nursed her patiently, telling her stories about Naples, about what their life might look like, about his dreams for their future. He sketched constantly, showing her designs for buildings he hoped to create someday when Italy was rebuilt. Naples in September 1945 was a city of ruins. Allied bombing had destroyed entire neighborhoods. People lived in rubble, scavenging for food, trying to rebuild from nothing. Antonio's family had survived, but their apartment had been damaged. They lived in 3 rooms instead of 5, sharing space with Antonio's sister Maria and her 2 young children. Charlotte met her new family with trepidation, uncertain how they would receive an American bride. But Antonio's mother embraced her warmly, speaking rapid Italian that Charlotte could not understand, but whose warmth transcended language barriers. "You are welcome," Antonio's father said in careful English. "Any wife of Antonio is our daughter now." The first months were harder than Charlotte had imagined. She could not speak Italian beyond basic phrases. She could not find familiar foods or understand local customs. She lived in a damaged city surrounded by poverty and desperation, working alongside Antonio's family to rebuild what the war had destroyed. There were moments when Charlotte questioned her decision, when homesickness overwhelmed her, when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then Antonio would take her hand, would look at her with love that transcended language and culture and circumstance, and Charlotte would remember why she had chosen this path. She had chosen love over comfort. She had chosen truth over expectation. She had chosen to become someone new rather than remain someone safe. October 3, 1995. Charlotte and Antonio Russo stood in the Arizona desert where a prisoner of war camp had once existed. The barbed wire was long gone, the barracks demolished, the guard towers dismantled. Only a historical marker remained, noting that this land had housed Italian prisoners during World War II. Charlotte was now 74 years old, her auburn hair turned silver, her face lined with decades of experience. Antonio was 77, his dark curls gone gray, his architect's hands spotted with age. They had returned to America for the first time in 50 years, invited to a reunion of former prisoners and the women who had loved them. 37 couples attended the reunion, men and women in their 70s and 80s who had defied convention to build lives together. Some had stayed in America, navigating immigration laws and community hostility to establish families. Others had gone to Italy, like Charlotte and Antonio, creating homes in a country foreign to the women but made bearable by love. All had paid prices for their choices, families divided, careers abandoned, reputations destroyed. But looking at their aged faces, Charlotte saw no regret. She saw people who had chosen courageously, who had built meaningful lives from wartime connections, who had loved across boundaries that were supposed to be absolute. Susan Palmer and Marco stood together, their hands intertwined with the unconscious ease of 50 years of marriage. Mary Chen and Giovanni laughed over shared memories. Dorothy Morrison and Dr. Benedetti, both widowed after long marriages to each other, embraced like young lovers. These were the women who had dared to dream, who had risked everything, who had survived judgment and condemnation to create families that now included children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The reunion was celebration of courage, testament to the power of love to transcend hatred and war. Charlotte had been asked to speak. to share her story with younger generations who could barely imagine a time when loving someone from a different country was considered treasonous. She stood before the assembled group, Antonio beside her, and spoke about the journey that had brought her from a small Arizona diner to a life in Naples she never could have imagined. "I chose love over duty," she said. "I chose truth over comfort. I chose to see Antonio as a human being rather than an enemy. These choices cost me my family's approval for many years. My parents did not speak to me for 15 years. They never met their grandchildren until those children were almost grown. The price was high, but the rewards were higher." Charlotte and Antonio had built a life together in Naples, raising 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural. Antonio had become a successful architect, designing schools and hospitals in the rebuilt city. Charlotte had written books about Italian culture, becoming a bridge between American and Italian understanding. They had created something beautiful from wartime tragedy, had proven that love could overcome hatred if people were brave enough to choose it. Looking back over 50 years, Charlotte had no regrets about the choice she made in 1945. As the reunion ended and couples prepared to depart, Charlotte stood once more at the site where she had first seen Antonio through barbed wire. The desert looked the same as it had 50 years ago: red rocks, endless sky. But everything else had changed. The enemies of war had become partners in peace. The impossible love had become enduring marriage. The woman who had risked everything for forbidden connection had built a life richer than any safe choice could have provided. Charlotte took Antonio's aged hand and smiled, grateful for every difficult choice, every painful consequence, every moment of courage that had led her to this life, this love, this legacy of proving that the human heart recognizes no borders when it finds its true home.